Mr. President, as you know today, we're going to have a number of speakers coming down to talk about the deal that's been negotiated between the P5+1, that's China, Russia, Great Britain, Germany, France, and the United States, and Iran. And what's before us today is something called a motion of disapproval. And I know that the procedures that we deal with sometimes here on the Senate floor can be very confusing to the public, but we're going through a process where we're trying to seek cloture. Cloture is a vote where people decide they're going to end debate on a topic and move towards the final vote, to cast their vote on the substance of what it is that's before us. We had a similar type vote before we left on Thursday, and we had 58 senators, a bipartisan majority, that wanted to move to a final vote. As a matter of fact, we'd had senators from both sides of the aisle on the floor for some time, debating the issue. One of the most sober, respectful debates that we've had since I've been here. But the minority of senators here voted not to end debate. In other words, that's what the general public believes is a filibuster, and it kept us from being able to move to a final vote. And so, because there has been some confusion, Mr. President, what I thought I would do is lay out what is exactly happening here and how we got to this process. Under our form of government, the President himself decides when he enters into an international agreement, he decides as to whether that's going to be a treaty, which, as we know, requires a 2/3 approval by the United States Senate, or whether it's something called a congressional executive agreement, which is a little bit lower threshold, or whether it's just a pure executive agreement. In other words, the President himself has the ability, if he so decides, to enter into an executive agreement. One of the problems with an executive agreement is it doesn't live beyond that president's term. And when you invoke an executive agreement, what you're really doing is you're bypassing the buy-in of Congress. As a matter of fact, I thought Senator Flake on the floor last week made one of the most salient points that has been made, and that is, since the President and his team decided to cut out Congress and to attempt to do an executive agreement, they made no attempt whatsoever to get the buy-in of Congress. And that's why we've ended up in the situation that we're in. When I realized that the President, through this process, was going to enter into this agreement solely by himself, an executive agreement, which he has the ability to do, but that he was also going to use something called a national security waiver to do so. Now again, this gets a little complicated, and foreign policy can sometimes be complicated, but Congress on 4 different occasions passed overwhelmingly in this body and overwhelmingly in the House of Representatives something that puts sanctions in place on Iran to try to bring them to the negotiating table. We did it 4 times. And I have to say, in almost every instance, the administration pushed back against us putting in place sanctions. They said, oh, the other countries won't be with us, and this will create problems. What happened as a result of us saying, no, we're going to sanction Iran, we're going to do what we can to bring them to the table to end their nuclear program, what happened was the other countries fell in line. They put in place similar sanctions to the ones that Congress put in place. When we passed those 4 sets of sanctions, we gave the President something that is common, and that's called a national security waiver, where if a crisis came up, he had the ability to waive those sanctions if he thought it was in our country's national interest. So, when he decided to enter into an executive agreement around these negotiations with Iran and bypass Congress, what he also decided he was going to do is to use his national security waiver to waive the sanctions that Congress put in place. Some of us on this side of the aisle realized that was very problematic, that because we brought Congress to the table and because we put the sanctions in place that we did, we thought it was inappropriate that the president used the national security waiver. And by the way, we realize now that he was going to put a national security waiver in place for 8.5 years and come to Congress 8.5 years down the road to waive those sanctions permanently. That was long after the essence of this deal would have been done and over. And so we were able to work with the other side of the aisle and pass a bill that has put us in the position that we are today, and that is allowing Congress to weigh in before those congressionally mandated sanctions are waived. And of course, if those sanctions are not waived, then in essence, the Iranian deal cannot go forward under the terms that have been laid out. So a lot of people have said, well, Congress gave away authority. They enabled the president to do this without entering into a treaty. That is totally untrue. The president has the ability, if he decides, to enter into an international agreement through an executive arrangement, as he's done, if he so chooses. Now, again, the problem with that is it doesn't stand the test of time because the next president can come in and alter that. As a matter of fact, this is the first time that I can remember that Congress has taken back authority from the president, because what we really did was said, Mr. President, no, you cannot go forward with this deal until we have all of the information, both classified and unclassified, and it's paused for 60 days while we go through this review process, which we know ends, it's debatable because we don't have all the materials, but they would say ends this week. And so this process wouldn't even be occurring if Congress hadn't taken back the authority that we took back from the president, put this pause in place, and gave ourselves the ability to either approve or disapprove. In this case, because many people believe that the president squandered this opportunity, squandered it. Here we had brought this rogue nation to the table, had a boot on its neck, its economy was suffering, and here we have this rogue nation that somehow has ended up in a situation where the president and others have negotiated to allow them not to end their program, which is what was said in the beginning. And by the way, let me just say that had the president held to what he said on the front end, which was we were going to end Iran's nuclear program, what we'd be having today is, again, almost unanimous support for this agreement. But instead, they squandered that opportunity, squandered it, and instead have agreed to allow them to industrialize their program and a whole host of other things that had nothing to do with the nuclear file. But let me get back to the process. The president decided he was going to go straight to the United Nations. Congress said, no, you're not going to do that. You're going to come to us, and we're going to decide whether we approve or disapprove. So we have a lot of people out there, some, I guess, just don't understand. Some, I think, do understand, but they're trying to somehow or another create this narrative that Congress is enabling the president. The fact is, we'd like to have had more of a say in this. I would have liked for this to have been a treaty, but since the president determines whether these are treaties or executive agreements, and he decided in this case it was an executive agreement, again, what Congress has done is said no and taken back a degree of authority. Now, unfortunately, what's happening is we have a minority of 42 senators that have decided that we're not going to allow an up or down vote. That's what's happened. And what was dismaying to me was the minority leader during August decided that he was going to filibuster. I have a lot of respect. I think people know we've worked closely together in trying to make the Senate work here, but was very disappointed that somehow or another this was going to take on a sort of a Tammy Wynette feel to it, if you will, that, we're going to stand by our man. We're not going to cause him to have to veto a resolution of disapproval. Somehow or another, instead of this being the sober, serious debate that we thought it was going to be, where a majority of senators were going to be able to express themselves in order to protect the president from having to veto something that the majority in a bipartisan way of the Senate disapproves of, somehow or another we've got this process underway. I do want to say to the leader of the Senate, I appreciate very much the fact that up until this point, what he has agreed to do and has done is he's filled the tree. Again, another term that I'm sure sounds very unusual to people who are watching the Senate floor and don't understand the processes. What he's done is said, no, up until this point anyway, we are not going to have a bunch of amendments that are tough for people to vote on. We're going to keep the debate to one topic, and that is the motion of disapproval. And that's what's before us. So tonight, in a second effort, beginning at 6 o'clock this evening, we are going to have a vote. And the vote is going to be about whether, this is what the essence of it is. It's about, should we end debate and move to a final passage? I think plenty of people have had their say. Others are going to be coming down to the floor today to talk about the merits of this deal and the demerits of this deal. But I would hope that, again, the minority, which seems intent on trying to keep the president from getting a motion of disapproval, which the majority of people in this body believe should be the case, in order to keep him from having to veto the will of the Senate, a minority of people here are keeping that vote from taking place. So let me just close with this. I want to thank my friends on the other side of the aisle for two things. I want to actually thank everybody in this body. Since 2010, 4 times the Senate has weighed in to put crippling sanctions on Iran. Those sanctions brought them to the table. That was something that was done in spite of the fact that the administration was pushing back. Secondly, this body, with a vote of 98-1, passed the Iranian Review Act, in short, now called Corker. We passed that on a 98-1 basis, knowing that the president was issuing a veto threat up until an hour and a half before the committee vote took place. And when they realized they were going to be crushed, I hate to use that word, but overwhelmed in that committee vote, they lifted their veto threat about an hour and a half before that took place. But again, on a 98-1 basis, this body said, no, we want to weigh in. We won't have the right to approve or disapprove. We want to pause. We want to see all the documents. And by the way, we've had 12 hearings in the Foreign Relations Committee, 12. All kinds of other one-on-one briefings. So we've had plenty of time to look at this. The American people, as a matter of fact, know more about this deal than they ever would have known about had that process not been put in place. And again, it was put in place because the president decided he wasn't going to cause this to be a treaty. He wasn't going to ask for us to weigh in. He wasn't going to ask us on behalf of the American people to approve it. He was going to do it himself and go directly to the UN Security Council. Matter of fact, he's done that. Matter of fact, they moved the implementation date back so we could have our chance of weighing in this way. And certainly, we'd love to have much greater power and authority over this. So, thank you for putting the sanctions in place to everyone here. Thank you for allowing us to weigh in. Let me remind people that if the president had achieved the goals that he set out to end Iran's nuclear program, in other cases he said dismantle Iran's nuclear program, what would be happening here on the floor today is there'd be an overwhelming, I would say, unanimous vote in support of what the president did. But what's happening is we have a bipartisan majority that opposes this. And even those people who've come out in support of this have done so tepidly. They've talked about all the problems in the agreement. As a matter of fact, now there's a huge push to try to come up with a Middle East policy because we know we have none to push back against what is in this agreement. I'm going to have more to say, but I realize my good friend, Senator Hoeven, is here. I wish I had known 4 minutes ago he was here. I've known him 4 minutes into his time, and I yield the floor. But I just want to remind people in closing, had the president done what he said the goal of the negotiation was, to end their program, we'd have unanimous support. Instead, we have a bipartisan majority that opposes this bill. We have a minority that has kept us once from being able to vote up or down. I hope with tonight's vote that will not be the case. I hope we will have the opportunity to send a motion of disapproval to the president. I know that he has said he would veto that, but I think it's important for us and the will of the body and the will of the country to be heard and for it to reach the president's desk. With that, I yield the floor.